September 1983, midnight in the New Mexico desert. A convoy of silent, unmarked trucks arrives at a desolate landfill in Alamogordo under a veil of secrecy. There were no witnesses, only the low hum of heavy engines and the biting chill of the desert wind. They weren't here to dump common waste. They were here to bury a crime of corporate arrogance that would haunt the tech industry for the next 30 years. Millions of video game cartridges, the absolute peak of early 80s. Technology were dumped into a massive jakt. Giant bulldozers crushed them into thousands of plastic shards before a thick, suffocating layer of concrete was poured to seal the tomb forever. What could possibly drive the world's most successful tech empire to physically execute its own products in the dead of night? This was the beginning of the end. Before the world knew the names Apple, Google, or Amazon, there was Atari. In the late 70s, Atari wasn't just a tech brand. It was the burning sun around which the entire cultural universe revolved. It remains, to this day, the fastest-growing company in United States history. A meteoric rise that turned a simple garage hobby into a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut that defined a generation of dreamers and rebels. They didn't just sell plastic boxes. They sold the ultimate dream of control. For the first time in human history, you didn't just watch your television, you commanded it. You were the pilot, the athlete, the hero. But every great Greek tragedy starts with a hero who believes he has surpassed the gods. Atari's spectacular fall from grace remains the ultimate cautionary lesson in corporate hubris, greed, and a total loss of vision. It all started with Nolan Bushnell, a tall, charismatic engineer with long hair who looked more like a rock star than a CEO. In 1972, with just $500 and a rebellious dream, he birthed a legend in a smoke-filled California bar called Andy Cap's Tavern. He didn't have a business plan. He had a feeling that the world was ready for something that had never been seen before. Interactive entertainment for the masses. His weapon of choice was Pong. It was incredibly simple, just two white lines in a square, bouncing back and forth. But it was so addictive that the first prototype actually jammed not because of a software bug, but because the coin box was literally overflowing with quarters. People were lining up for hours just to move a bar up and down on a screen. The world's long-term addiction to digital dopamine had officially begun. By 1976, Bushnell knew he had a revolution on his hands: the Atari 2600. But to put a computer in every living room in America, he needed a scale and capital he simply couldn't afford on his own. He made a fateful deal with the devil. He sold Atari to the media giant Warner Communications for $28 million. It was the moment the original sin of the company was committed, trading freedom for corporate muscle. It was a clash of civilizations. The creative, barefoot hippies from Silicon Valley were suddenly forced to answer to the cold, calculated suits from New York's boardrooms. Bushnell's rebel spirit was now under the heavy thumb of corporate executives who didn't understand the product, only the profit margins. The friction was immediate, and it would eventually become deadly for the company's creative soul and its future. At first, the river of money was blinding. By 1980, Atari was an unstoppable behemoth, controlling a staggering 80% of the home video game market. They were responsible for more than half of Warner's total global profits. Inside the headquarters, the executives felt untouchable, basking in a level of success that made them believe they were invincible. This was their first fatal mistake. They confused luck with genius. The New York executives began to suffer from what historians call a Midas complex. They truly believed the Atari logo was a magic wand that could turn any product into pure gold. They decided they no longer needed visionaries or creative risks. They just needed a famous brand and a rigid shipping date. They began to view their customers not as fans, but as a guaranteed revenue stream that would buy anything they put on the shelf. The real genius is the brilliant programmers who wrote the code and built the hits were treated like invisible ghosts. They weren't given credits on the game boxes, nor were they rewarded with bonuses for their multi-million-dollar successes. The suits told them plainly, "The machine sells itself. You are just a replaceable cog in a very large wheel." This internal war between art and commerce was about to have a devastating price. This disrespect triggered a massive brain drain. The top talent walked out of the building and formed Activision, the world's first third-party game developer. Atari's response was pure arrogance. They ignored the rising competition, believing their brand name was an unbreakable shield that would protect them forever. They didn't realize that a brand is only as good as the trust it builds, and that trust was about to be burned. By 1982, the Great Dilution had begun. Because Atari failed to implement any kind of quality control, the market was flooded with digital trash. Everyone from dog food manufacturers to cereal companies was rushing to release terrible, broken games for the Atari system. The industry was becoming a wild west of shovelware, where quantity was prioritized over quality. And the consumer was the one who suffered the most from it. Store shelves were screaming with garbage software that often didn't even work. Consumers were becoming confused, frustrated, and increasingly suspicious of every new release. The Atari magic that had once defined a generation was being suffocated under a mountain of broken code and unfulfilled promises. The industry was a ticking time bomb, and Atari was the one holding the match that would eventually set it all on fire. But the board of directors wanted one more mega hit to dominate the holiday season. They paid a staggering $25 million just for the rights to Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. It was the most expensive licensing deal in history at that time. However, in their pursuit of profit, the executives made one truly insane demand that would go down in history as the single worst decision in the gaming world. They gave their lead programmer only 5 weeks to finish the entire game to hit the Christmas deadline. 5 weeks for a project that required at least 6 months of development and testing. It was a mission impossible from the start. The result was a technical nightmare, a confusing, buggy mess where the characters spent most of the time falling into endless pits. It wasn't a game. It was a high-priced frustration simulator. Atari's hubris didn't stop there. In a fit of pure corporate delusion, they manufactured 12 million Pac-Man cartridges for the 2006 100 system. The glaring problem? They had only sold 10 million consoles in total. They literally expected people to buy the game twice, or buy a new console just to play a subpar port. It was a mathematical impossibility fueled by an ego that had completely lost touch with the reality of the market. The Pac-Man port was an insult to the fans. It was flickering, ugly, and the sound effects were grating to the ears. It was the exact moment the American public realized they were being scammed by a company they once loved. The betrayal was felt in every household, and the word of mouth was toxic. The Atari name, which had once represented the cutting edge of the future, was now becoming a synonym for corporate greed. Christmas 1982 became a corporate funeral instead of a celebration. Millions of copies of E.T. and Pac-Man were shipped back to Atari by furious retailers who couldn't sell them even at a massive discount. There was no warehouse on Earth big enough to hold that much physical failure. The golden goose had died, and in its place was a radioactive liability that was threatening to pull the entire parent company, Warner, into the abyss. The financial impact was a total bloodbath. Atari began losing $10,000 every single minute. Warner Communications' stock price didn't just drop. It evaporated, losing billions in market value overnight. The era of easy money was over, and the industry was looking at a dark horizon. The dream of the home console was dying, and Atari was the one who had poisoned the well for everyone else in the business. 1983 saw the great video game crash. It wasn't just a simple recession. It was a mass extinction event for the industry. A $3 billion market collapsed to nearly zero in a matter of months. Wall Street analysts and major newspapers declared that video games were a dead fad, a momentary craze that had finally met its end. The throne of gaming was empty, and it looked like it would stay that way forever. To hide the evidence of their incompetence from shareholders and the prying eyes of the press, Atari ordered a secret, desperate convoy. Trucks loaded with millions of unsold E.T. and Pac-Man games drove into the New Mexico night toward a remote landfill in Alamogordo. It was a desperate attempt to erase their mistakes from the history books and clear the balance. Sheets of the physical evidence of their greatest failure. They used massive steamrollers to crush the pride and joy of Silicon Valley into the desert dirt. Then, they poured a thick, industrial layer of concrete over the site, literally trying to bury their corporate shame so that no one would ever find the remains. They were burying the future to try and save their stock price in the present, unaware that they were creating the most famous urban legend in the history of technology. The Atari Cemetery became the industry's greatest myth. For 30 years, people debated in forums and bars if the story was even real. It was a ghost story told to young CEOs about what happens when you stop caring about your product and start caring only about the numbers. It was the legend of the empire that committed suicide in the desert, leaving behind nothing but a sea of crushed plastic and broken dreams. In 2014, the truth was finally unearthed for the whole world to see. Film crews and archaeologists dug through the New Mexico soil under the scorching sun. The world watched in anticipation as the heavy machinery began to move. And then, the desert finally vomited its secrets. They found them, thousands of crushed ET cartridges, still purple and yellow, still carrying the undeniable stench of the 1983 corporate collapse. But while Atari was busy burying its past, a small company from Kyoto, Japan, called Nintendo was carefully taking notes. They studied Atari's corpse like a medical autopsy, looking for the exact cause of death. They learned the ultimate lesson of survival. Quality control is not an option, it is a necessity. They realized that if you lose the trust of the player, you lose everything. You cannot sell trash and expect an empire. Nintendo's famous seal of quality was born directly from the ashes of Atari's fire. It was a promise to the consumer that the Atari shock would never happen again. In a strange, poetic way, Atari's spectacular and boneheaded failure was the fertilizer that allowed the modern gaming industry to grow into the $200 billion giant it is today. Without their fall, we might not have had our rise. Today, the name Atari is nothing more than a nostalgic logo on a vintage t-shirt or a retro console. But the DNA of their failure lives on as a warning to today's tech giants. Whether it's Google, Meta, or Apple, the moment a company thinks they are too big to fail and starts ignoring the quality of their soul, the New Mexico desert starts calling their name. The cycle of hubris is a wheel that never stops turning. Atari didn't die because of a bad game or a lack of advanced technology. It died because it lost its heart. It stopped respecting the very people who made it a success, the players. What was your very first console? Did you survive the crash of '83, or did you join the journey later? The history of gaming is written in the stories of those who played through the chaos and lived to see the digital rebirth. The story of Atari is a stark reminder that the future belongs to those who lead with passion, not just those who lead with spreadsheets. Every empire has its sunset, and every legend has its flaws. If you want to see which modern giant will be the next to fall into the pits of history, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our next corporate autopsy. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The desert is listening.